Kenneth Womack, welcome to the Russell Scott Show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on this blustery day.
You've written so many books, Kenneth, about the Beatles that not even you know how many. Perhaps you've written so many that it's some sort of record. I don't know. What started you down this long and winding road? When did the Beatles get their hooks in you?
They got their hooks in me in 1977. I was 11 years old, and I heard them for the first time in the Beatles cartoons, and I was gobsmacked. I had no idea where they'd been all my life, and it just really it staggered me. You know, I wasn't prepared for their sound, and fortunately, I had quite doting parents who insisted that if I was going to study to listen to the Beatles and be interested in them, I also should study them and know what they were all about. So. Quite literally, that first day they went to the library and they brought back a bunch of Beatles books. And there weren't many back then, but certainly nothing like the thousands that exist today. But it set me up well.
There are, as you say, thousands of books written on the subject. Is there so much meat left on that bone that you really feel that your book contributes to the overall narrative?
In terms of double fantasy, there was tons of meat on the bone. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to write it was because it was a story that had been told in dozens of places and sometimes very thoroughly with great research, but it had never been told in total. So I wanted to have a place where it would all exist and you could understand from beginning to finish what happened. What brought John out of his seclusion and how did he bring all of those great songs into existence in the nick of time?
On my last show, we discussed the 1964 U.S. tour with Ivor Davis. You've done some collaborations with Ivor Davis. Today we're focusing on John Lennon's life in 1980. There's a 16-year gap between the mop-top Ed Sullivan version of John Lennon and the New York Yoko Ono version that your book, John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in the Life, details. Can you provide both myself and the audience a Cliff Notes summary of how his life bridged from 64 to 1980?
You bet. And I like that you've asked the question in that way, because I think we can understand him better by looking at those bookended moments, because, they both happen in New York City, which is at one point the place that he said he was always meant to live, and indeed, of course, does, that he should have been born in the village, he once stated. And so for this reason, it makes a lot of sense for us to think about all of the changes that are wrought between that incredible moment on the Ed Sullivan Show, when the Beatles achieve a really unusual kind of international fame, and, of course, those last days in New York. By then, he is obviously much more mature. He has done a lot of hard growing up. He has certainly achieved an unusual kind of artistry and immortality. But I think, like most of us, if you had asked him, in fact, he said this, I believe, in so many words more than once, that toward the end of his life, he was finally starting to get it. That, it was starting to make sense. And of course, we all have those kinds of moments of epiphany. So it's a really great way of thinking about how his life changed from one place to the other.
Was the 1964 version that the public knew, was that the real John Lennon then, or was he kind of fronting for the Epstein version of the Beatles?
Oh, they were all fronting for that kind of mythology that they'd created amongst themselves. Very, very, they were creating a masquerade, if you will. And then, yes, it wasn't real by any stretch. They were creating sort of personalities in shorthand so that the world could quickly understand who they were and what their personalities were very roughly like, because, of course, those weren't exactly blueprints for who they were as human beings. And all four of them, whether you were the quiet Beatle and you were George, or you were the cute Beatle and you were Paul, really reacted over time badly to these personae because they would come to understand that there was a huge difference between what their everyday lives were like and the struggles they had, and then this sort of media friendly version that had been built. And that was a huge challenge for them as human beings. And I think they spend, certainly Lennon and Harrison, the rest of their lives trying to come to grips with who they are and who they were. For John, tragically so, because of course he makes a lot of these realizations only in the nick of time, literally as it's almost too late.
Much too late for goodbyes, eh?
Yeah, Dakota's son, sure.
So, speaking of Julian, he abandons Cynthia and Julian, and then it's only in the very end of his life that he reconciles with his estranged son. Am I right?
Yeah, in the early 70s, mid 70s, more like, I guess, they had spent some time out in California when John was with May Pang. And then there would be a couple of more visits in the later 70s, but it obviously was a great source of distress for John that he had been that way. But of course, we could sort of argue too, right, that it was a cycle of trauma because, of course, John had suffered a very similar fate himself. It would be the abandonment by his father. Would disappear when John was very, very young, 4 or 5, and then John would meet him roughly in 1964 after he's achieved this kind of worldwide fame, right? So that's when Freddie Lennon shows up.
Was he looking for a payday?
I would imagine, or at least, if not a payday per se, to be able to find his own sort of fame inside the Beatles bubble. I would put it that way. But probably, of course, what John and the other Beatles knew so well was that they weren't as liquid as people thought.
Oh, really?
Oh, no, no. In fact, George Harrison loved to say that, you keep telling me I'm a millionaire. He'd say this to the accountants, and can I see it? And they'd say, well, no, not today, But of course, they were millionaires, and in fact, they were wealthy. But that's a very different thing, of course, from being so liquid that, you can move big pieces of money around. And of course, the Beatles and their representatives were only just figuring this kind of stuff out in the 1960s. Some of them were figuring it out for the first time for the entire industry.
Well, wasn't it Paul McCartney who came up with the idea of licensing the music? And he had talked to Michael Jackson about that at some point in the 80s, I think.
No. That was a much different story than that. What had happened, McCartney and Lennon had, at George Martin, their producer's behest, had started to work with Dick James in the very early in their fame, in order to protect their song interest in their publishing. And, like a lot of those sorts of deals that novice rock stars and the nouveau riche find themselves falling into, they were giving a lot of money to other people. They got to the point, though, roughly in 1968 or so, where in early 1969, they were able to buy back their publishing. It was a rare moment, and they were actually cash poor at the time and were unable to move enough money around to do so. Hence, it would fall into what we call ATV publishing for many, many years. And in, I believe it was 1983, it was going up for a silent auction, and Paul McCartney had the chance to repurchase on behalf of himself and Yoko Ono, the Lennon estate, those publishing rights, the agency rights, essentially, to the songs. And he was outbid by Michael Jackson, whom Paul, ironically, had suggested get into publishing. This was obviously a terrible strategic error on Paul's part, and not notifying Michael Jackson, by the way, but rather not putting in a commanding bid, which he was very capable of doing.
Well, they could have had a very decent bidding war, I'm sure.
Well, it wouldn't have been a war. It was a silent auction.
It was a silent auction, excuse me.
Paul would have won.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it was, in fact, some have argued that they probably told Paul what he needed to bid, and he may have been cheap. But, of course, that created quite some stress for some time.
And of course, the backbone of Michael Jackson's wealth for the rest of his life.
Yeah, well, what it created for Michael Jackson was a very lucrative piece of property that he could mortgage to Sony when he had such, I mean, I've heard the number $100 million worth of cost overruns on his history album.
Oh, no.
And anyway, that put Northern Songs back, ATV rather, ATV Publishing back into limbo. And, at this point, I believe, thanks to some friendly legislation, McCartney et al. Now have control again. Well, what they were really lacking, of course, was an agency fee. They having to work through an agent, Sony ATV Publishing, in order to leverage their music.
I wonder how accepting they were at the Dakota for a guy like John Lennon. And the big issue is whether or not you're going to disrupt the tenants of the building. So imagine a guy like John Lennon coming in. I wonder how he was received.
Well, not perfectly well, until they got to know him and they realized that as a person, he wasn't so much of a challenge. What they really were stressed out about were the number of fans who, as the 70s wore on, would begin to congregate around the entrance, or in many worse cases, would begin to sneak around the hallways and, try to find him, in spite of the building's fortress-like appearance, as people are saying, right? There was a certain kind of fan who would find their way into the building, sometimes very innocently, sometimes nefariously, and it just caused a lot of stress. Lauren Bacall, for example, was quite annoyed by it, not necessarily by John Lennon, but by her previously quiet apartment building being assaulted pretty regularly. I mean, packages would be coming all the time. The switchboard would ring off the hook, that sort of thing.
You say sometimes people had nefarious reasons. Do you think, this is a bit grim, but do you think the assassination of John Lennon was inevitable then, just with how accessible he was as a person?
I don't think it was ever inevitable. His accessibility was a risk, but if we go back to the 70s and into 1980, people didn't see it that way then. It was a very different world. The fear about wealthy residents like John Lennon and Yoko Ono was kidnapping, that someone would try to kidnap Sean and attempt to ransom him, and that was fear. So,
like the Lindbergh baby type situation.
Sure, and the 1970s were rife with kidnappings, and of course it was the great period of hijacking. So people were really on the lookout for those sorts of happenstances to occur. The idea of someone murdering somebody out of the blue, simply wasn't on their radar in the way that celebrities think about it now. It was almost the beginning of that curve, and when it began to start happening, because of course, if you ask any police officer, right, or rather homicide detective, the first thing they're going to tell you is when there's a murder is, let's look at who knows them. And the idea that someone who doesn't know somebody at all would sort of come in like a bolt out of the blue seemed far-fetched. And in fact, even today, it is still kind of far-fetched. But of course, we live in a completely different world. And that was one of the things I was excited about doing with this book, was trying to recreate that world of 1980 so that we could see ourselves back in it, if only for a few hundred pages, and try to get the smell and the feel of what was a very different New York City than we know today.
Only 4 months after the assassination of John Lennon, you had the attempted assassination of President Reagan. And both events had similarly stupid justifications behind them. As you say, without motive, really.
Right. And then there would be famously in the early 80s, I guess, the killing of the one young actress by a fan from the show My Sister Sam, I believe. I'm not laughing at her. I'm laughing at the title, because I remember thinking I didn't watch the show then. Right. But I knew it existed. And it was so, again, like those two, the attempt on Reagan and the murder of John Lennon, they were highlighted by their randomness.
I was last in New York City in 2017. Greatest place I've ever been. It's all they say. What is the difference? I mean, we've all heard about the Giuliani years and how he changed the city. What are the major differences between 1980 New York and present day?
Well, if you look at photos of John and Yoko outside the Dakota during that period, you can actually see most of them, because The building was drab, it was unkempt, it was tarnished and dirty. This was shortly before the city began to enact ordinances on cleanliness and upkeep for its aging edifices and buildings, etc. There was also a very big difference in crime. The Lennons lived next door to the park. Yoko still does, and you wouldn't go there at night. That would change in the future when the police presence became different. As you said, the Giuliani years certainly had a law and order effect on the city in advantageous and disadvantageous ways. There was also a strong sense that New Yorkers lived in neighborhoods. Sure, they could get in a cab and go to a play or, head uptown or head downtown, but they really lived where they lived. Your grocery store, your bodega was, a block away. For the people in the Dakota, the Dakotery, as they sometimes called themselves, you were kind of bordered by Amsterdam Avenue and the park, right? You'd go several blocks north and several blocks south. There was a kind of people lived more locally. And of course, that was true not just in New York City, but in suburbs across the world or small towns across the world, right? There was just a different kind of approach to daily life. One of the reasons certainly had to be the fact that consumers were not eating out like 6 nights a week like they do now, or having take in or take out or what have you. DoorDash, I guess, would be the term now, right? Whereas, back in those days, most people only ate out a few nights a week. So there was a very different approach to how you use your free time, your disposable income, how your life is scheduled in terms of rhythm and routine. So all of those things really concluded with a very different kind of world than we know today. And that's the world John Lennon lived in. He lived in that smaller world where many of us watched the same television shows. I think about, after doing this deep dive, that John and I watched a lot of the same TV.
Yeah. We all had a shared reality. Now you can go in so many different directions. It's far more unique, the experience.
That's right. Yeah. So when I'm 11 years old and I'm watching One Day at a Time, he probably was too, or Love Boat, or because that's what people did. He watched Saturday Night Live religiously. So did I. So,
The Love Boat. Yeah, that was exciting and new.
And you're right. It was more of a shared experience. And the same thing could be said for music and sports, because we didn't have so many different outlets to consume music. And we certainly didn't have 24-hour sports, not even close to it. If you didn't live in a certain area, you didn't have access to what may have been your favorite sports teams or what have you.
What was John Lennon like privately, if that's something that anybody would know other than Yoko Ono and those who lived with them? But I've heard from people who knew him that he was very much the same in public as he was in private, affable, had a mischievous sense of humor.
That's my understanding, and I really came away from this work thinking a lot about how much John really loved people. I mean, he really liked people, and again, it may go back to his upbringing and his need to be connected, but whatever it may have been, he really had a strong sense of wanting to know people, and they would come up to him, whether it's in the city or a restaurant or wherever, and ask questions about his life. He would often turn those back to them. What are you doing? He'd heard enough about himself, right, long before then, and was bored with it even, and was ready to start hearing other people's stories. And you can hear him say things very much aligned with this position when you go back and look at many of those great interviews that were conducted shortly before his death.
So while he had been fronting, as I said, in 1964, by the end he was exactly who he was privately and publicly.
Yeah, probably so. And, he had just, like all of us, if we're fortunate, he had gotten to the point where some of the things that would have just sent him into a fit, maybe even 2, 5, 7 years earlier, just didn't bother him in the same way. He was able to understand the value of experience more than an outcome you can't necessarily control. My favorite scene with John and Yoko is right before, maybe a week or so before he's murdered. And she has come to learn that the album is moving a lot more sluggishly than she and David Geffen had expected. And it's just a beautiful moment. She goes to him because she knows how important it is for him to really make this comeback stick and be a real triumph. And because, for one thing, he wants to return to England for the first time in 9 years, and having a big hit, somehow in his mind, he'd connected the two, to go back like a conquering hero. He may have even used that phrase at one point. In any event, she comes to him to tell him this, and rather than react, and the fact that she was scared to come talk to him or a little concerned says a lot. Instead, John just said, "That's okay. We've got the family." And I think about that a lot, because it's really John having arrived at a certain place in his life that if we're all lucky, we do too.
I've heard people say that Double Fantasy would have been a runaway success had it only included the 7 songs written by Lennon and not the additional 7 by Ono. What are your personal thoughts on Yoko Ono's contribution to Lennon's music?
Well, first of all, I think they're dead wrong on that one, because they're forgetting, again, the book is about 1980 New York, not current New York, right? They're also forgetting how competitive the music charts were in the fall of 1980, and really had been for a while, and would only become more so in the early 1980s. This was a tough marketplace. I don't think it mattered whether John had Yoko songs or not. In fact, she had, not that people necessarily based their consumer behavior on this, but she had been achieving better reviews, arguably, than he had. I think it has everything to do with that marketplace. I believe that John and Yoko had put the right kinds of media out with print and radio and other sorts of interviews. But what they needed to do, and the album was, I think, set to be number 8 the week of his murder. So, he was at least matching roughly Wings' last album, although the buzz around this was much larger because it was John returning after so many years away. But they had done the right things to really sew up an even bigger hit in the new year. The Annie Leibovitz photo would have caused a huge stir when it came out on Rolling Stone. Instead, we all saw that photo for the first time when he's dead. And of course, it's a completely different, heartbreaking, really, kind of experience you have in that way. They needed to go on tour. And they had every plan to do so in 1981. And, if you can imagine John Lennon and Yoko and a band, on a major tour across the country, the album's number 1 at that point. And they're building incredible buzz. And that, in fact, that's what a lot of folks in their shoes had to do at that point. It actually has a lot of good comparison to what's happening now, not in COVID now, but now in the music industry. If you're a dinosaur act, and we didn't really use that term back then, but if you're an act who is a legacy act, you need to get on the road. And Paul McCartney figured that out. In fact, for Back to the Egg, the last Wings album, he had conducted a mini Scottish tour in late 1979. Well, he planned to go to Japan, of course, and that was derailed. And then ultimately, likely an American tour. So he was doing the things, or preparing to do the things you have to do to get behind an album, because the world was changing. And it was a crowded marketplace. You had Blondie and Disco, and all of the big acts were releasing things. The Who, the Stones. You had Donna Summer. Billy Joel was owning things in 1980. You had, all of these different genres sort of merging together. When you look at the hit parade in 1980 into 81, it is staggering how quickly it moves from a country crossover hit like Lady by Kenny Rogers, I believe was number 1 for much of the fall of 1980. You have all of this, all of these people, artists, legacy and new, competing for our ears. And it was a big competition because, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, back in those days, we didn't have 24-hour sports to compete with music. We didn't have 100, 200 cable channels. We had 3 networks and a couple of independent stations. There were literally lots of time when nothing was on TV that you wanted to watch. So the competition was extreme because the world was smaller.
So in 1980, he comes out of Seclusion. They release Double Fantasy. Why does he go into Seclusion in the first place?
Well, of course, people have chattered endlessly about that issue. I sort of follow Occam's razor, I guess, and I try to look for the simplest solution, and the simple solution is he's just exhausted. I mean, he's he's basically been barnstorming through life since he was about 18, and the Beatles' experience was exhausting by all of the ex-Beatles accounts in itself. Throw in John's many legal fronts that he was working on through the early 70s, most importantly, immigration. And I think we begin to understand just how crucial that level of exhaustion must have been in his thinking. And of course, then he has this an infant in the house, which changes everybody's life, whether you have lots of servants and wealth or not. And of course, John felt keenly that he should be in Sean's life. And so there were certainly a lot of different kinds of pressures pulling on him, but I've just got to believe he was exhausted from it all and just worn out. He also found himself, after Apple expired, Apple Records, in the beginning of 1976, when their contract with EMI expires, he doesn't have to do anything anymore.
Well, do you believe the Beatles would have gone on to record more music together or performed again had Lennon not been murdered?
I feel confident in saying they would have, only because everybody else did. For one thing, Lynyrd Skynyrd will have a comeback in the 80s, and 2/3 of them are dead. So there really isn't. There's just too much money into it. And in the Beatles' case, the money was becoming overwhelming. It was in the hundred millions when John died, and was swiftly moving toward $1 billion. And I think it would have been difficult for them to pass up on that kind of money if they could have, done something charitable on such an immense scale. Now, would it have been a good reunion? I don't think so. John Lennon made this point several times. We could get back together. And, there was always this sort of, and we may, ellipse, right? But we won't be the same guys. They left those guys back in August 1969, so they would be their new selves, and they would be doing it in the 1980s. And part of what makes them so special is they have such an authentic sound, and the 80s were such, for good and ill, such a plasticine period. I don't know that would have been the best time. I can imagine them sounding really awful in a lot of ways.
When I was young in the 80s, I remember my father telling me how much Julian Lennon sounded like his father and could have easily plugged and played into the Beatles should they want to reunite as a band. Was that ever something that was seriously proposed?
I doubt it. They would joke about it a lot. I'm sure some, maybe more than one entrepreneur, tried to interest something, but I doubt that was something they were really going to consider. One thing, we have to give them credit for, while they would get into trouble, with their publishing at times or other sort of business entanglements, they understood very early on that it was their master tapes that mattered the most, and owning their masters and the way they have tried to preserve their legacy and surrounded them with people who think about them in terms of the high quality, the distinctive nature of their achievement has really served them well.
Have you seen the movie Yesterday?
I have.
What did you think of that?
I thought it was okay. I mean, as a movie, it had a couple of problems. One, the leads had no chemistry. Mostly because the guy was almost like asexual or something, and they couldn't generate any of the passion that would, to my mind, help make sense in terms of a love story, that bridges space and time and lost Beatles and all those things. So I was disappointed in that way. I also felt like if it had been done better, that scene where John Lennon shows up alive, which is the logical mathematics of the movie's conceit, right? It should have had us, and it did have some people, in a puddle of tears. But I just thought, why did we not arrive here in a more powerful way? So I guess I was looking at it like a writer.
You don't write a lot about Mark David Chapman. I assume this is deliberate. I even notice in a lot of articles they'll avoid using Mark Chapman's name and simply refer to him as Lennon's assassin or murderer, etc. Do you purposefully avoid writing about him?
That's such an interesting question. I don't. I know a lot of folks work from the premise that he was a fame monster. That's the reason he was there to commit that heinous act, and they're probably right. But to me, it wasn't necessary at all in this book to refer to him by name, just for the simple reason that this book was being written based upon what John was experiencing and things that John knew about. So I kind of set up this rule for myself at the beginning about only limiting my purview to what John could have seen and understood and experienced. And he saw Mark David Chapman for a minute on the afternoon of December 8th, signed an autograph for him, asked him if it's what he wanted, because of course he was trying to make sure he had pleased this person that he just met on the street. And that was really it. And so I guess for me, it felt like, John didn't know who he was. He shouldn't have any more presence than anybody else who was nameless on the street, other than we know the significance of him later. And, other than Chapman's testimony, we don't know that John really registered him, right, coming back that night. We don't know that at all. So I really left it at that.
What do you think John Lennon himself would have thought about the whole occurrence? Do you think he would have forgiven Mark David Chapman for his actions? I mean, it seems to me from Mark David Chapman's own words that he seems to show remorse.
Yeah, although I've had occasion, especially this year, to talk to a number of folks who are in contact with him who still feel like his narcissism is still driving everything with him. I'm not on the parole board. I'm not directly one of his victims. I'm just one of the billions of victims who lost his important presence in the world. But I'm certainly not part of, John's family or the people who have to uphold the laws. But I'm not sure that we can see that from him, actually. But I have no idea. John was a pacifist. He may very well have forgiven him rather. We see lots of examples of John being very generous in that kind of way. I mean, his own murder may be a different thing, right? But he held a much higher standard for himself, which is interesting. But a lot of generous people do.
So it had been 5 years since Lennon's last album, Shaved Fish, which has a lot of great songs on it. What gets him back into the studio?
Well, he had, never really stopped composing. So he had quite a backlog of material. He had a lack of confidence in it at times that may have affected him. Probably very likely did. He had tried out several different genres. He tried spoken word. He'd been trying to write something longhand, a musical, an audio diary at one point, things he called mind movies, which were little miniature stories on tape. But he really gets to the point where he has, a kind of critical mass of songs, particularly Watching the Wheels, which had gone under several names by this point. It was really starting to become a foregone conclusion for him, even though there was a kind of nervousness about throwing himself back into that very competitive fray and, competing with big names like Elton John and Paul McCartney, people he admired, but, had this interesting track record that they'd been working on all throughout the 70s. So, if he were apprehensive, it would make sense. He had begun to sail, which was very important to him. He wanted to learn how to do something himself. It became very exciting in his life. He had also heard Paul McCartney in April 1980 when the Coming Up single was released, and he was pretty blown away by the very unusual sounds that Paul McCartney was achieving and how he was being experimental and not resting on his laurels. And, this really affected John.
How does Double Fantasy compare with his other work?
It's very much like it in the sense that it reflects what he's trying to do in that moment. And in that moment, he's thinking deeply about where he is in life, his son. He really is on a kind of, even though he would never quite say this, he is on a kind of redemption tour in a way. You can hear it In those interviews. He'll talk about his abusive behaviors, particularly toward women when he was younger. In fact, in the one longish interview with Playboy's David Sheff, he says, I'm going to have to live a long time to atone for the things I did when I was younger. So he's taking a lot of ownership of things, his lack of attention to Julian, et cetera. And it's, so that kind of, I think, in its own way accounts for the slightly muted nature as opposed to the hard rocking songs he'd done earlier in the decade.
Gotcha. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
no, it absolutely just reflects where he was at the time.
So would this have been like Elvis's 68 comeback special?
But their career arcs and the arcs of the Beatles versus Presley are just so different, and particularly how their legacy has progressed. John wasn't desperate. Elvis was desperate. Elvis had put himself in a certain position. He had trusted Colonel Tom Parker for so long and down more than one tough road. And I don't think John was functioning in quite the same way. I don't think he had the same sort of dilemma that was sort of ruling over him at the time.
The Beatles changed throughout history. You can clearly define the era that they are in with their music. Then you look at a band like Nickelback, which has no growth whatsoever.
Right, and I would add this to that point. The Beatles changed album to album. They never rested on their laurels. They always wanted to have a new sound. I don't know that. I think a number of their songs in the later years exist outside of the 1960s, and that's distinctive. Whereas Nickelback, like you said, doesn't change and are highly contingent on their moment. And it would be hard to call what they're doing classics. Whereas, the minute people heard A Day in the Life, you start imagining where it's going to be in the pantheon of great music, right? So there's
what is the peak of Lennon's musical genius?
Wow. I have no idea. That's a great question. I mean, in my younger years, 10 years ago, I would have told you it was 1968 through 1970 when he really hit some very important strides. But now that I've spent time with this other record and his music in the 70s, I don't know that he'd reached it. I don't know that he'd gotten there. And since honesty and self-reflection were so important to him, the fact that he was probably being slightly more honest with himself suggests to me that, we wouldn't be able to make that distinction. But I can find something in every one of his periods to admire, that's for sure.
It's so weird that Lennon was barely 40 at the time of his death, which in today's world is like still considered to be quite young.
Yeah.
40 then is like 50 now.
I mean, back in those days, right? If you had a birthday party at work, they would be bringing in canes and wheelchairs. Yeah, and we laugh at it, but it's true. That would be the joke. And it's just a blip now of nothing.
Well, when you read about great people such as Lennon and how much he did by the age of 40, it really makes me feel like I've lived a wasted life.
Yeah, I understand that, but it also should remind us why he was exhausted, right? Yeah, he got there step by step and was just tired. And I guess fortunately had created the right legacies over the years, and the right alliances with people who could help him manage that output.
But with a little help from his Prellies.
Well, certainly in the early years.
Not just his friends.
Yeah.
I don't know. Was that something that he was still doing in his final years?
I offer the only things I talk about are moments when he talks about. He has a heroin relapse, according to his audio diary, in late 1979, and he's mad at himself about it. So I mentioned that. But again, if it's not in his purview and his story, it doesn't go. It didn't go in. I was really interested in the odyssey that took us from, okay, I've got all these songs. Is something going to happen to the end? I do hope they think about this as being about the way John lived as opposed to just another, and it isn't, another true crime book, and that it's really attempting to be about what that kind of comeback can be late in life, because it is late in his life, even though he and we did not know it at the time, and just the energy and optimism that his kind of self-discovery generates for him. I think it's palpable, and it changed the way I look at life, just thinking about it so deeply.
Where can the audience learn more about you? Can the audience interact with you, ask you questions?
All they have to do is go to kennethwomack.com, drop me an email, and you'll hear back from me.
Kenneth Womack, really appreciated your time today. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Okay, thanks so much.